Well, hello there, and welcome to another edition of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I am back as we're going down Reconnaissance Road. Now, I am here with my Sucomorph assistant, Greg Kenny, and we are doing another in the reconnaissance arena, but another viewer request. And you know who you are. I can't use your name, or you might come after me at some point and say, why are you doing that, from the thousands of people that are now texting me or emailing me. So I can't do that. But we are going to be doing the Blum and Voss, the BV-138, known as the Sea Dragon. They gave it an aggressive name, but of course it was known to the crews as the Flying Clog. Now today, Greg has gone all out with my fish, dolphin. I think this is a dolphin. And I am going to go ahead and toss this off camera. Oh, there you go. Another fine catch by the Kenny. Now, I do not have a BV-138, but I am going to use a Martin product to go ahead and use as my illustration, so to speak. Now, the BV-138, as I said, nicknamed the Sea Dragon, the Flying Clog, was the main German seaborne reconnaissance aircraft during the war. They made 297 of them. And they were actually, if Greg can get some images, they're deceptively, the photographs don't do anything for their size. They were actually really, really large. They had 3 engines. The interesting thing about the engines on the BV-138 was that, Greg, they were diesel. They were diesel aviation engines, which is very unusual. Usually diesels have more torque. They're used for marine engines, but not for aviation engines. Now, the reason they did this, Greg, why? The Germans are very practical. They did this because they could refuel from U-boats while they were at sea, which meant, now think about this, Greg, as far as their range. You can refuel with U-boats who could be thousands of miles from wherever their base is that they shipped out. So you had an aircraft like that, you could basically have almost unlimited range as long as you had U-boats that had spare fuel. So you could run this thing all over the place. And as I said, it was quite large. Now, Greg can throw up a plan view of the BV-138. I'll go ahead and use this Martin. The original design on the BV-138 featured what we show on this Martin on the wing design was it had a gull wing. They quickly realized in the prototype that they could not get enough lift out of that wing. And then later they went to a straight wing with that big, tail behind it. It was fairly heavily armed, and it also carried, for long-range reconnaissance, it could carry a low-band UHF radar. So it was a very potent weapon. The aircraft was introduced in 1940. Its first flight was in 1937. It was designed by Richard Vaught, who designed it. And again, really practical designer. The reason it got the name Flying Clog was because of the hull space. It had a hole on the front of it, and it tapered much more than this Martin at the back, and then it drooped down, so it kind of looked like a clog. The other thing was, it was a tank as far as an airplane. It was big, heavy. It could be launched from a catapult, which I talked about. The size in pictures is deceptive. It was a very large aircraft. But remember, the Germans at that time, what they were trying to do was interdict maritime commerce around the British Isles and anywhere that Britain had merchantmen, because this thing, it could carry bombs, it was heavily armed, it could sink a merchantman. So the idea was, or it could find that enemy fleet or the concentration of ships. But the idea behind it was it was robust enough that it could operate away from base. So the Germans correctly surmised that what they did is, rather than take on the British head on, what they were going to do is they're going to have these raider squadrons that were going to attack British commerce and British fleets attacked the fleet. The BV-138 was a perfect weapon for that. It was big enough, it could take care of itself, it could see over the horizon with a UHF radar, it could carry external stores, bombs, and things like that. So it was really the perfect weapon. The fact that they used the diesel engines as an example is just ingenious. You don't see that anywhere else in the fleet air arms of anybody else doing that. They just weren't doing it. So those UMO diesel aircraft engines are just, that's actually, to me, a real very interesting development of this program. It's interesting that the Allies, who had to have known what the Germans were doing with this type, and the Japanese, the Axis, never built anything similar to that I'm aware of. Maybe they did, and if they did, you need to let me know in the comment section, but I'll learn something. One of the things we are doing today is you had to be part aviator and part mariner with a flying boat, because you're tooling around the water with these big boats. They're basically like, they're not like you're running around in a little skiff or a lifeboat. These are big things. They had to be towed. They had to run around. They could sink. You could be lost at sea. You're out there by yourself. So the salute today is anybody who is involved in maritime activity with these flying boats. There's not a lot of people. We still run into some folks with our PBYs. I don't think I've ever run into a Japanese float plane operator or a German float plane operator. We're going to talk about that in a second. But if you were an operator of one of these aircraft or in one of the squadrons and you saw any operational history during the war, because these things, remember, after World War II and in the interwar period, there were still float planes out into the 1950s. But with the advent of helicopters and helicopters that could land on water, the need for these aircraft just completely evaporated up into the middle 1950s and beyond. They just weren't relevant at that point. Some of them were still around, but they weren't a relevant weapon. But if you were a float plane operator, a maritime interdiction operator during one of the wars, I salute you. And I do it today with Greg is going all out. I had the hat. The aircraft's name is the Sea Dragon. I have, of course, Dragon Ball Z. For you Dragon Ball Z fans, or if you have kids, Kamehameha. There you go. Blowing people away with that. This is a Power Warrior drink. This is one of these full license things by Funimation. I mean, they got the 160 calories, total carbohydrate 15%, vitamin B3 150. There's a lot of vitamin B3 in this, Greg. You're maybe doing something healthy for me here today. So I'm going to pop this. It's cold, and we will see as I salute all of our maritime patrol operators with a Dragon Ball Z. I don't even know if this is a power drink. We'll see. You know, the last one last week was stale. This one, not quite as bad. It fizzed a little bit, but it's a power drink. I don't like that sickly sweet, but it is actually not bad. Obligatory second sip. Not terrible, but not going any further with that. So by the mid, I would say 1943, where you had about mid-1943, air superiority in both theaters was changing towards the Allies. And what ended up happening is both the BV-138 and any maritime assets of the Germans became more and more under stress from fighter sweeps and fighter attacks, and the Japanese suffered the same fate. Anything that was on the water or a float plane, pretty much once the Allies got marginal air superiority, and then into 1944, They dominated the skies. They were decimated. And these things, this aircraft was 177 mile an hour top speed airplane. It wasn't something that was going to outrun fighters, and it didn't have enough defensive armament to defend itself. So what ended up happening, the Germans continued to experiment with different ways to use it and different payloads, to the point where they actually experimented this on water with JATO, rocket motors, to launch it off, which is pretty insane. But they actually experimented with it, launching the BV-138 off water. It actually worked, but by that point it was purely academic. At the end of the war, they didn't have air superiority. These aircraft couldn't defend themselves as they were falling back all across France and anywhere that they had no place to launch them. They were going away. They still had some seaplane bases up in Denmark and in the Norway waters, but the aircraft became pretty much completely irrelevant to the war effort. And then at the end of the war, they went away. There was no need for them. Now, they were so shot to pieces that no complete airframe exists in a museum today. Think about the build rate. You would think one would survive. That's not the case. There are two that I know of that have been identified on the ocean floor. They're sunk. And then there's one in a museum in Denmark that was raised. It was actually flown at a British air show and crashed off Denmark, and then in 2000 they raised it. It's in very poor shape, and I doubt that we'll ever see a BV-138 in any usable condition. But they are an amazing aircraft that was operational, and to the viewer that suggested it, thank you very much. We're going to be stepping up now from the war era up until the late 40s and early 50s with our next aircraft. Now, if you want to amaze your friends, you can go and get on the link on this, and there's actually a helicopter here, but maybe we could get like a mini BV-138, and you could fly around identifying the battleship. This is a fictional battleship in that there was no number 88 in our inventory that I can think of. But if you want to, I almost dropped it there, Greg, almost. If you want to amaze your friends, click on that link and Jason will float down to the post office. We're just doing the whole thing today. And he will get you one of these. Now, we cannot do what we do without your donations. I'm standing in front of our D-Day exhibit here. And of course, this was really the demise of the BV-138, which what started it. So we cannot do that without your donation. So click on the donation link, donate a few bucks. We can certainly appreciate it. And if you came across us on YouTube, we would love to have a subscription and a comment. We do one take, basically Warbird videos with my stalwart assistant, Greg. And if you have people you know that actually like that, go ahead and forward a link to them. We would love your comments. We get your comments all the time. And if you think of something that you want us to cover, there was a gentleman who just suggested, Greg, we cover retarded bombs, the bombs with parachutes and stuff like that. I actually think that would be someplace in the future a very interesting thing, and we are going to try to figure out how to work that in. We don't do a lot of ordnance, but that's another weapon that's kind of gone away. Really, you don't use them as much as you do with precision aircraft, but we are going to take your suggestions and work them into our programming. If you came across us on Facebook, give us a like and a comment. And of course, if you're on Instagram, maybe they're going to cut me down into a little tiny reel and give us a comment on Instagram. My name is Fred Bell. I am the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Thanks very much. Have a great day.